Dr. Nadia Williams had never expected a day like this. The buzz of the courthouse, the sharp echoes of heels on marble floors, the brief exchanges of lawyers in hushed tones, all felt distant as she stood at the front of the courtroom. Judge Samuel Clark, a seasoned and respected figure in Washington's legal circles, looked at her over the rim of his glasses with an air of finality. His expression was stern, his tone unwavering. "You are hereby fined," he declared, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "for failure to comply with federal data release regulations. This is a serious matter." He paused as the court clerk wrote the details of the ruling, the sound of the pen on paper like an ominous clock ticking down the seconds. Nadia's mind raced as she processed the words. She hadn't anticipated this. Her work as a leading advocate for government transparency had brought her national recognition, but it had also earned her a certain amount of scrutiny. She had been instrumental in developing tools that allowed the public to track government spending and understand how taxpayer dollars were being used. But for all the praise she received, there were always those who viewed her initiatives as an inconvenience, a disruption to the old ways of doing things. Nadia wasn't the type to back down, but standing here in this moment, facing a fine from the very system she had worked to improve, left her feeling like an outsider. She had spent years pushing for laws that would force agencies to release information, ensuring that government actions were no longer shrouded in secrecy. Now, it seemed, the system was pushing back. The judge continued, explaining the nature of the fine in dry, legal language. Nadia struggled to focus, her thoughts drifting as the weight of the situation settled in. She couldn't help but wonder if this ruling was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. She had been a fierce advocate for transparency, sure, but had she crossed an invisible line? Were there forces at work here that she couldn't see? The faces around her blurred in her peripheral vision, her focus entirely on Judge Clark, who was now wrapping up the case. "Court is adjourned," he said, and the gavel slammed down with a sharp finality that rang through her chest. She stood there, still absorbing the shock, as the room began to empty out. Nadia felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and she couldn't help but wonder if this fine was merely the beginning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of the haze. She glanced at the screen and saw an anonymous number. She hesitated before answering. Something told her this wouldn't be just another routine call. "Dr. Williams," a voice on the other end asked, low and cautious. "You might want to look into the people behind that fine." Nadia's heart skipped. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dr. Nadia Williams didn't start out as a political figure. She wasn't born into privilege or surrounded by powerful connections. She was raised in a modest home in a bustling urban neighborhood, where she quickly learned the harsh realities of life for those without a voice. Her parents, hard-working immigrants, taught her the value of knowledge, justice, and self-advocacy. Yet it wasn't until Nadia moved to Washington, D.C. for graduate school that she truly understood how little most people knew about the inner workings of the government they paid taxes to. At the university, Nadia found herself immersed in the world of public policy, focusing on the intersection of technology, governance, and civic engagement. She was captivated by the idea that transparency in government could be the key to breaking down systemic inequality. It wasn't just about knowing how funds were allocated. It was about giving the public the power to hold their leaders accountable. Her first big breakthrough came during an internship with a government watchdog group. Nadia spent countless hours poring over government documents, deciphering complex budget reports, and finding obscure loopholes in how public funds were tracked. She quickly realized how easy it was for federal agencies to obscure where taxpayer dollars were going. This was the moment she decided to dedicate her life to changing it. Nadia's focus shifted to creating open data platforms, online tools that allowed citizens to easily access, track, and understand government spending, contracts, and budgets. She envisioned a future where anyone, from a concerned citizen to a journalist, could find and interpret this information without needing a degree in political science. What began as a personal mission grew into something much larger as she partnered with other advocacy groups, technology experts, and even key legislators who shared her vision. Over the next few years, Nadia's efforts brought about sweeping reforms. Laws that had once been tangled in bureaucratic red tape began to shift, and her initiatives made government operations more transparent than ever before. She helped craft legislation that required agencies to release comprehensive data sets on public spending, making it easier for the public to track where their money was going. Nadia's name began to circulate in Washington's corridors of power, and she became a go-to consultant for lawmakers pushing for more accountability. But with every victory came a new set of enemies. Not everyone was thrilled about the new levels of scrutiny. High-ranking officials, contractors, and even corporations who had benefited from the opaque nature of government dealings began to push back. Nadia knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but she was undeterred. The more her work grew, the more she realized that the system she was trying to change would fight back, often in unexpected ways. As she looked down at her phone, the anonymous caller's words lingered in her mind. Look into the people behind that fine. Who would want to silence her now? Who had the power to make a judge issue a fine against someone trying to do good? Nadia's sense of urgency intensified. This wasn't just about one ruling. It was about something bigger, something hidden beneath the surface. The phone call had left Nadia unsettled, but she wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Her work had attracted attention before, some of it positive, some of it not so much. But this felt different. The voice on the other end of the line had sounded cautious, almost too careful, as if the caller feared being traced. Still, the message was clear. There were forces at play here, and they wanted her to know it. Look into the people behind that fine, the voice had repeated before hanging up. Nadia stared at her phone for a moment, the silence heavy. She had a feeling this wasn't just a random call. Her instinct told her someone knew something that could help her understand why the court had targeted her this way. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about silencing her, one way or another. The problem, however, was who to trust. In Washington, everyone had an agenda. Allies were hard to come by, and she had made plenty of enemies along the way. But if someone was trying to bury her work, it would be just like them to hide behind shadows. She needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. Nadia decided to take a few days to quietly dig into the matter. She began by reviewing her recent projects, looking for anything that might have ruffled feathers. Nothing stood out immediately. No new policies, no controversial moves. But she knew something was brewing beneath the surface. She remembered an unsettling conversation she'd had with a former colleague, someone who had warned her that her transparency efforts were treading on dangerous ground. Could that have been a veiled warning? And if so, from whom? She started with the paperwork from her recent project on federal contracting. Nadia had spearheaded a major initiative to make government contracts publicly available, a key step toward reducing corruption and increasing efficiency in government spending. She had fought for years to ensure that the details of these contracts, who was bidding, who was winning, and how much taxpayers were really paying, became public knowledge. This was a game changer for oversight, and she had known it would ruffle some powerful feathers. Nadia's eyes scanned the data on her computer screen, her brow furrowing as she clicked through document after document. The deeper she looked, the more she realized there was something off about her case. The fine she had received was tied to a specific error in a recent data release. It was an unintentional mistake, a clerical oversight, one that she had already addressed with the agency involved. Yet, here it was, being used to target her. Someone, somewhere, was making sure this error was amplified. Just then, Nadia's email dinged with a new message. It was a simple subject line. Important. The sender's name was familiar, but the email address was new. The message read, "You're not imagining things. You need to dig into the people behind the contracts you've been exposing. They're watching you." Nadia's heart skipped. Whoever was behind this was playing a much larger game. Judge Samuel Clark had always prided himself on being impartial, a stickler for rules and procedure. For years, he had operated with the belief that his decisions, while sometimes tough, were grounded in the law. He had little time for personal emotions or distractions, preferring to stay focused on his role within the legal system. But as the days passed after his ruling against Dr. Nadia Williams, something nagged at him. It wasn't the fine itself. He was used to handing down penalties for infractions, but rather the feeling that he had missed something important. His colleagues in the legal community had mentioned Nadia's name here and there, but it was in passing, mostly during discussions about the broader push for greater government transparency. She was an advocate, they said, someone who had made waves with her efforts to hold the government accountable. Still, Clark had never paid her much attention. She wasn't the kind of person who appeared regularly in his courtroom. That was, until her case landed on his desk. At first, it seemed straightforward. Nadia Williams had been cited for a minor infraction related to federal data release. Nothing too complicated. The fine appeared to be routine, an unintentional oversight in a sea of government bureaucracy. He'd handed it down without much thought, his judgment clouded by the weight of the court schedule and the details of a system he had long accepted. But something about the case kept him awake at night. The more he thought about it, the more he realized there was more at play here than just a simple legal matter. Curiosity began to gnaw at him. Was there something bigger going on behind the scenes? The anonymous tip about Nadia's influence in the transparency movement sparked a thought. Was it possible that the fine wasn't about the infraction at all, but rather about silencing someone who was disrupting the status quo? Clark decided to take a closer look into Nadia Williams. He'd never had the time, or the inclination, to delve into the lives of those who came before him in court, but something told him this was different. He reached out to a trusted colleague, a former law school classmate, who worked in the field of government transparency. "Samuel, you're telling me you find Dr. Nadia Williams." His colleague's tone was a mix of disbelief and concern. "She's one of the biggest advocates we have for open government. Her work has redefined how federal spending is tracked. She's helped push through laws that require agencies to make their contracts public." Clark felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't known this. The more his colleague explained, the clearer it became that he had unwittingly penalized someone at the heart of a movement that was changing the way government did business. A sinking feeling settled in Clark's chest as he realized his mistake. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about the larger forces trying to silence someone who was shaking up the system. Nadia wasn't just a random figure. She was a symbol of accountability and transparency, someone who had dared to make the government more open, and in doing so, had made powerful enemies. Judge Clark knew what he had to do, but undoing a mistake this big wouldn't be easy. The weight of his realization pressed down on Judge Samuel Clark. He couldn't undo the fine he had imposed on Dr. Nadia Williams, but he could make things right. He couldn't let his reputation, or his conscience, be stained by a decision he now recognized as both misguided and unfair. There was no easy way out of this, no simple apology that would erase the damage done. But one thing was clear: he needed to speak to her. He arranged a meeting, aware of the delicate nature of the situation. He wasn't just reaching out to a random litigant. He was speaking to someone who had become a central figure in a nationwide movement for transparency. A movement that, as he now understood, was deeply disrupting entrenched systems. Judge Clark wasn't accustomed to admitting errors, especially not publicly, but this was different. This wasn't about legal procedure. It was about doing the right thing. The meeting was set in the courthouse's quiet back office, a room where the sounds of the outside world felt miles away. When Nadia arrived, she greeted the judge with a polite but wary smile, her sharp eyes scanning his expression. She had been expecting a formal apology, though she wasn't sure it would come. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Clark began, his voice unexpectedly soft. He motioned for her to sit across from him at the table. The room was small, almost too small for the weight of the conversation they were about to have. Nadia sat down, her posture straight but relaxed. She had expected the usual pleasantries, something about protocol, maybe a defense of his actions, but none of that came. Instead, Clark leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I've made a mistake," he said, the words heavier than he anticipated. "I issued a fine against you without fully understanding the scope of your work. And now, I realize it was a decision based on incomplete information." Nadia raised an eyebrow, not sure if she was hearing him correctly. For a moment, she remained silent, processing the unexpected turn in the conversation. She'd imagined many scenarios in which Judge Clark would admit some form of fault, but this level of honesty was disarming. Still, she had to be careful. Apologies in her world were often a precursor to further entanglements, not resolutions. "I'm listening," she said carefully, her voice measured but curious. "What do you think you missed?" Clark took a deep breath before continuing. "I didn't understand who you were, what your work represented, when the case came before me. I knew of you, of course, but I didn't grasp the significance of your efforts. The transparency projects you've led have made a real difference. They've pushed for laws that allow citizens to track government spending, and you've become a driving force behind those changes." Nadia's gaze softened, but only slightly. This was no longer just about a fine. It was about the broader implications of his words. "And you think that fine was more than just a simple penalty?" she asked, her voice low. Clark nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I'm beginning to think someone wanted you silenced, and I'm starting to wonder if I played into that, without even realizing it." The truth of his words hung in the air between them, raw and unspoken. Nadia's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Whoever had orchestrated this wasn't just interested in a technical mistake. They wanted to undermine everything she had worked for, and that, she realized, was something much larger than any fine. "I think you're right," she said quietly, meeting his gaze for the first time with a steady, unwavering look. "But the question now is, who exactly is behind it?" Clark shifted in his seat, the gravity of the moment not lost on him. "That's what we need to find out." The conversation with Judge Clark lingered in Nadia's mind long after the meeting ended. His admission of error had been unexpected but welcome, at least as much as a judge's apology could ever be. Still, the words that had come after were the ones that resonated. "Someone wanted you silenced." She had suspected it for days, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The problem, however, was the magnitude of the forces she was up against. This wasn't just a small bureaucratic hiccup. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As the days passed, the pressure on Nadia grew. People she had worked with in the past began to distance themselves. Calls went unanswered. Emails went unreturned. Even her closest allies in the media were now more hesitant, tiptoeing around the subject of her fine, avoiding the risk of drawing attention to the controversy. It was as if the very act of supporting her had become dangerous. Nadia wasn't naive. She knew how things worked in D.C. She had seen the power plays, the subtle coercion, the way information could be weaponized. But this felt different. This felt like an all-out attack. It wasn't just the people who were now silent. It was the ones who were starting to speak in whispers. During a routine meeting with a colleague, she noticed a slight tremor in his voice as he mentioned the fine, followed by an awkward attempt to change the subject. Something was off. Nadia had always trusted her instincts, and they were telling her that she was now in the crosshairs of something far more insidious. A few days later, the first threat arrived. It wasn't the kind of threat you'd expect. No angry letters or ominous phone calls. This was subtler. Nadia received a link to a website. The page contained an expose on her, one that distorted the facts of her work, suggesting she was overstepping her boundaries, even implying that her work had caused damage to the efficiency of government operations. The article was filled with half-truths and vague insinuations, carefully crafted to tarnish her reputation without outright accusing her of anything illegal. It was a smear campaign. And it was just the beginning. As the days wore on, the attacks grew bolder. Nadia's social media accounts were flooded with fake accounts spreading misinformation, and her phone buzzed with anonymous tips that were clearly designed to intimidate her. She could feel the walls closing in, and the more she pushed back, the more the pressure mounted. But Nadia wasn't one to be easily scared off. This wasn't the first time she'd faced resistance. It wouldn't be the last. But now, it was personal. It wasn't just about transparency anymore. It was about protecting the very integrity of her work. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Nadia knew it was time to take action. If the system was coming after her, she needed to find out who was behind it. And she needed to do it fast. The stakes had never been higher. But the question was, how much could she trust the people around her, even those who claimed to be on her side? As she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. This time, the message was simple. They're trying to stop you. You're getting too close. Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just the constant stream of anonymous messages or the rumors swirling in Washington. It was the sheer intensity of the pushback, covered, calculated, and relentless. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to chip away at her reputation without ever directly confronting her, and it was working. But Nadia wasn't about to let it stop her. If anything, the threats only fueled her determination. She had spent years fighting for transparency, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine it now, not when she was so close to achieving real change. Her next move had to be strategic. The idea of confronting this unseen enemy head-on was tempting, but she knew better than to rush into a fight without all the facts. She had to expose the people who were orchestrating this campaign, those who were pulling the strings behind the curtain. Judge Clark, who had become an unexpected ally in her battle, had been pushing her to dig deeper. If you're going to fight this, he had told her during their last meeting, you need to know exactly who you're up against. He wasn't wrong. Whoever was trying to silence her had more power than she could have imagined. Nadia enlisted the help of a few trusted individuals, a tech expert who had worked with her on government data projects, and an investigative journalist who had long tracked the undercurrents of Washington's power players. Together, they began piecing together the puzzle. The breakthrough came when they uncovered a connection between the smear campaign and a prominent lobbying firm, one that had quietly been pushing for looser regulations on government contracts. The firm had close ties to several high-ranking officials, including those responsible for approving the very policies Nadia had worked to change. It wasn't a stretch to think they had a vested interest in seeing her fail. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear. The fine, the smear campaigns, the threats, it was all part of a larger effort to discredit her and derail the transparency movement she had worked so hard to build. But who was calling the shots? And how far would they go to make her disappear? Nadia's pulse quickened as she read through the documents they had obtained, each one revealing another layer of this tangled web. The more she learned, the more she realized just how far-reaching this fight had become. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about exposing the people who had the power to shape the very systems of government for their own benefit, and who weren't afraid to use whatever means necessary to protect their interests. The story was beginning to break wide open, and it was clear that the stakes were much higher than Nadia had initially thought. It wasn't just her career at risk. It was the future of transparency in government itself. This was her moment. If she could expose the people behind the attacks, she could not only save herself but change the course of history. Nadia stood at the precipice of a battle that would determine everything. And she wasn't backing down. As she picked up the phone to call Judge Clark, she knew the next move was critical. There was no turning back now. The pieces had finally fallen into place. With the help of her allies, Nadia had gathered enough evidence to expose the shadowy figures behind the smear campaigns and threats. The lobbying firm, with its deep ties to government officials and contractors, had been working in the background to halt the transparency reforms that Nadia had championed. They had underestimated her, thinking that a few calculated moves could silence her for good. But Nadia was no longer the underdog. She was the force of change they couldn't control. Nadia and her team had prepared a detailed exposé, and the time had come to make it public. But she knew that the moment she released it, the entire narrative around her would shift. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about taking down the corrupt systems that allowed those with power to operate in secrecy, unaffected by the people they were supposed to serve. The decision wasn't easy. The risks were monumental. The backlash would be swift. But Nadia had never been someone to back away from a fight, and this was the fight of her life. The morning of the release, Nadia stood in front of a small group of reporters in Washington, ready to address the press conference she had called. Judge Clark was there too, standing by her side. It was a quiet, powerful gesture of solidarity. He had learned the hard way that the system he had spent his career defending wasn't as impartial as he had once believed. Now he was using his position to help bring the truth to light. As the room settled, Nadia spoke. Her voice was calm, but the passion in her words was undeniable. For years, we've fought for transparency in government. We've pushed for laws that ensure accountability, that empower citizens to understand where their money is going. And yet there are those who would rather keep us in the dark. Today, we are shining a light on the forces that have tried to silence this movement. She laid out the full story, revealing the connections between a lobbying firm and the high-ranking officials who had worked to block her efforts. She explained how her fine, her reputation, and her work had all been targeted in a deliberate effort to stop the progress of government transparency. The room was silent as the weight of her words settled in. When she finished, the first question came from a reporter who had long followed her work. "Dr. Williams," she asked, "how do you feel now that you've exposed these powerful forces?" Nadia didn't hesitate. "I feel like we're at the beginning of something much bigger. This isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who has fought for transparency, anyone who has dared to demand accountability from those in power. This is just the start." In the weeks that followed, the fallout was immediate. The lobbying firm was exposed, and several key figures resigned amid the scandal. New legislation was passed, strengthening the country's transparency laws and ensuring that no government official or contractor could operate behind closed doors without oversight. Nadia's work, once a niche cause, was now the centerpiece of a national conversation about the need for open, accountable government. Judge Clark, who had once unknowingly been a part of the system that tried to undermine Nadia, became an outspoken advocate for the reforms she had championed. Together, they worked on new initiatives to further protect whistleblowers and promote transparency in all levels of government. Nadia's victory wasn't just personal. It was a win for everyone who believed in a government that worked for its people, not just the powerful. As she stood before a crowd of supporters, her voice strong and clear, she realized that her fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt the undeniable power of a movement that could never again be silenced.